Well, brothers and sisters, welcome back. I'm glad to see most of you seem to have come back after last night. And I hope you had a good night's sleep. Certainly it was very encouraging to begin our night prayer last night with my favourite verse from the whole Bible, from Psalm 127. He gives to his beloved slumber. It's always a very encouraging verse. And certainly I got plenty of slumber last night. In some of the conversations I had with some of you after last night's session, I realised there were some really important things that I should have said and that I didn't. So we're just going to slightly revisit the end of last night before moving on to today's session. Because I don't think you can talk about evangelism without talking about prayer. I think I wanted also to say that teaching people to pray is one of, I look better in a dim light, obviously. So. No, I like it, really. I just don't know about what everybody else thinks.
What do you guys think of the screen? I'm just getting a lot of people telling me they want it darker.
Yeah. I think they want it dark where they are, so when he gives his beloved slumber, nobody notices.
Stephen, have you heard the term Prince of Insufficient Light?
Yeah. So teaching people to pray is part of equipping, enabling and encouraging the church in evangelism. We mustn't separate these things out. And I look back to my own parish ministry with some shame that I think I took the view for many years that people knew how to pray and were praying. And I now think I was wrong. And if I was a parish priest again, I think almost the first thing I would do is declare an amnesty in the parish and say, let's learn how to pray. Let's learn what it means within the rhythms of our daily lives to be people of prayer. And the other thing which I should have said is kind of what's my working definition of prayer. Prayer is something it is hard to define, but I thought, let me tell you my working definition of prayer. It is this. Prayer is the lover coming into the presence of the beloved and saying, I love you. That's the best definition I can come up with for prayer. Prayer is the lover coming into the presence of the beloved and saying, I love you. And what I like about that working definition of prayer is it makes it very, very clear that prayer is, first of all, not something that I do. Yes, I do that activity we call prayer, and I must have discipline about that activity we call prayer. And the reason I must have discipline about that activity we call prayer is because I don't always have the desire. If you have the desire all the time, you don't need the discipline. But because most of us don't have the desire all the time, in fact, hardly have the desire at all, especially when you are, like all of us, except for one or two, a professional Christian who leads a lot of worship in church, you're absolutely fed up with prayer and worship. And so there is no desire, therefore we really, really, really need discipline. But the point of prayer is fundamentally it's not something we do. That's why there's, for instance, no such thing as private prayer, which is why I think many people have trouble with prayer. They're trying to do this thing called private prayer, which doesn't exist, therefore little wonder they're having trouble doing it. Personal prayer, yes, intimate prayer, but prayer is the opening up of my heart and mind to the prayer of the Son to the Father. Through the Holy Spirit I participate in the life of prayer which is going on without me. And prayer is what God does in me through the Spirit. And prayer is always God. God is the lover. We are the beloved. And God, the great lover, is constantly coming to his beloved and saying, I love you. And that's why it was so good that our worship began yesterday with the opening of Mark's Gospel, which I should have alluded to when we talked about the busy day in the life of Jesus and he went off somewhere on his own to pray, because the whole of Jesus' ministry can be understood as the overflowing of the affirmation he receives at his baptism. And at his baptism, Jesus knows that he is the beloved of God. And obviously you'll remember the story well. And of course it's fairly rare, even in Scripture, that the heavens open and God speaks. And when the heavens open and God does speak at Jesus' baptism, I think it will be notepads at the ready. This is going to be really interesting stuff. God is going to speak. I wonder what he's going to say, what problems he's going to solve for us. But the heavens open. God speaks and he says, "This is my Son, the beloved, in whom I am well pleased." Now I need to do an Essex joke here, but there's only one person in the room who's going to get the joke. Peter, you're skulking at the back again. I'm going to tell this joke. Only Peter's going to get the joke, okay? But I've just got to do it because Peter's here. This text from Scripture proves that God comes from Essex. Because in Essex and East London, where I live, my kids and a lot of kids have this habit of saying, they don't say something's very good or extremely good, they say it's well good. That's a kind of real Essex and East London thing, it's well good. Or if something's not good, it's not very bad or extremely bad or ever so bad, it's well bad. And I've had quite a battle with my teenage children, saying to them, you mustn't say well good or well bad, you have to say very good, very bad. But then my eldest son did quote back to me the Scriptures and say, well, at Jesus' baptism, God says, "This is my Son, the beloved, in whom I am well pleased." So there we are, a little Essex aside, that God, and of course, it is a profound theological truth that the Holy Spirit only speaks local dialects. That wasn't meant to be a joke, that was meant to be a profound theological truth. So that affirmation that Jesus receives at his baptism is central to the understanding of his whole ministry. He gives from the overflow of the affirmation he has received. He knows himself to be the beloved, and that is the heart of prayer. The heart of prayer is not God, it's not us coming to God with all our stuff, but our finding that place of receiving and replenishing where we know ourselves to be the beloved. And in the strength and affirmation of that, so the rest of our ministry proceeds. Okay, that's the end of, that's just like a little PS to last night's stuff, which I just felt I needed to say, having had some fascinating conversations with one or two of you last night. We're now on to today's session, Walking to Emmaus, Evangelism and Catechesis, and for the next few hours we're basically going to do a Bible study together, a nice long one. And for those of you, and I know some of you, that's the way you're wired up, for some of you who kind of want to know, so what's the practical outworking of all this? Well, on the one hand, you're going to just wish you'd booked another speaker, because you're not going to get a lot of that. On the other hand, that's what's coming tomorrow. That is coming tomorrow. Tomorrow, as we look about, so how does all this impact the life of the local church? That's more tomorrow's session than today. Today, we're just going to dig very deeply into the Scriptures to see what it tells us about the ministry of evangelism flowing from that knowledge that we are God's beloved and outworking in this particular story, the Emmaus Road story. And the reason I think this story is so important is because I see in it a paradigm shift in the way that we think about the ministry of evangelism. Now, I don't want to overplay my hand here, but I think it's just worth pointing out that until fairly recently, probably the last 20 years, the controlling biblical paradigm for the ministry of evangelism was probably the story of Paul on the Damascus Road. So if we were thinking about the ministry of evangelism, that was the kind of story that was in our mind as the kind of mental map of that's what this ministry is about. There is going to be a moment where someone will be confronted with the reality of God and respond in some way to the call of Christ. And the Damascus Road story, beautiful and powerful story that it is, had a real hold over the imagination and the praxis of the church when it came to evangelism, typified by, well, it's still true of many churches today. If you use the word evangelism, that's what they think we're talking about. They think we're talking about having some sort of an event where somebody stands up the front, like I'm standing up the front, they speak about the gospel, and people are invited to respond in some way or another. That would be true of the Anglo-Catholic tradition, with its great history of parish missions, certainly true of the evangelical tradition, typified by the big-name evangelist who'd come to town and preach the gospel, and you, the local church, would bring your people to that event, your people would get converted, and so on. We all know the pattern of evangelism that the Damascus Road story kind of mapped. I think we probably all, at the very least, observe that evangelism in our churches has changed over the last 20, 30 years. What's the Holy Spirit doing is always a very important question to ask ourselves. And it seems to me the most significant thing that the Holy Spirit is doing worldwide in evangelism could be summed up as the renewal of the catechumenate. And the renewal of the catechumenate is happening all over the world. It's happening, I believe, for a very good reason, and that is because as we shift into a culture where second or third or fourth generation people are growing up with little or no knowledge of the Christian faith, little or no contact with the church, we need a different model of evangelism. The model of evangelism which rested upon the upfront speaker speaking about the gospel, rested upon an assumption that many of the people listening would have quite a degree of knowledge about the Christian faith. And you were either recalling people to a faith they sort of had but had lost, or at least they knew quite a lot about. And we all know that that's not the case anymore. It's not the case in Canada. It's certainly not the case in Europe. I can't go into a school, for instance, in most of the parishes of my diocese and assume there's any real knowledge of the Christian faith. Whereas I think 30 or 40 years ago I could. 30 or 40 years ago I could have gone into a school and said, well, that story, the Good Samaritan, people would have known what I was talking about. They don't anymore. Even knowledge of the Lord's Prayer has kind of pretty much disappeared in most of our culture. This is not something that people know. The only bit of Christianity that's left inside people in terms of knowledge of the story would perhaps be Christmas. That's the one bit of the Bible people know, though of course they learn about Christmas from Christmas carols and nativity plays, not from the Bible itself. So there's been a shift. And the interesting thing is that we can see the shift in the movement towards a different biblical paradigm for understanding the ministry. And I'd say, without wanting to overstate this, I think it's a shift from the Damascus Road to the Emmaus Road. And what I want to suggest this morning, as we look at the Emmaus Road story together, is that the Emmaus Road story offers us a more relevant biblical paradigm for the ministry of evangelism in the local church. Now again, let's not caricature this. The Damascus Road story is the story of a powerful turning around event in the life of Paul, but it's clearly set in the context of a journey. Paul is on a journey when this happens. The Emmaus Road story is clearly a journey, and at the centre of the story there is a turning around when Jesus is recognised in the breaking of the bread. So I'm not suggesting these stories are kind of massively divergent. But the Emmaus Road story does emphasise the journey much more than the Damascus Road story. And as I hope we will discover when we look at the story, it therefore suggests a way of approaching and understanding evangelism which I think is very, very relevant for most of our churches today. And the fundamental truth upon which all this rests is simply this. For most people, becoming a Christian is like a journey. For most people, becoming a Christian is like a journey. I mean, we're not going to do it, even though we've got 3 hours. That's not enough time. But it would be really interesting if at this point we turned to each other and simply shared the story of how we became Christians. Some of you will be able to tell me, I became a Christian at 11 o'clock on the 7th of January 1982. You know, you'll be able to tell me what day and what time. Some of you will be able to say that. But you will be in the minority. You will be in the minority. All the surveys that have happened over the last 20, 30 years have all shown that for most people, usually most surveys reckon it's about 75%, when they tell the story of how they became a Christian, they tell the story of a journey. The average length of time of the journey, in the research that was done in England by John Finney, was 4 years. 4 years. From that first sense that there may be something in this gospel to people becoming members of the church. You might also be interested to know that the Billy Graham Association did some research on this only 3 or 4 years ago, and they disagreed with this research. They discovered the average length of time was 5 years. So I say that simply because if you're carrying in your head some tired old churchmanship rubbish, could you please, get rid of it now? Cast out that demon from your head. It doesn't matter which bit of the church you come from. Nobody's interested, okay? Well, they're not. They're not. I mean, I'm talking about the people out there in the world. They couldn't care less about which theological college you went to, what your churchmanship is. And I don't care either. What matters is, this is what God seems to be doing. And in a culture where people are growing up without experience of the church, with little or no knowledge of the Christian faith, it's going to take time for most people to access and respond to the Christian story. And whatever churchmanship tradition you happen to come from, the renewal of the catechumenate, the rediscovery of a way of doing evangelism which is best understood as helping people make the journey, is the most significant thing that's happening. Let me just give you 1 or 2 examples. First example, the most obvious example, the Alpha Course. Now, I don't mind what you think about the Alpha Course. I don't mind whether you like or don't like its content or emphasis. The point is, the Alpha Course is probably the single most significant thing that's happened in evangelism, certainly in England and across much of the world in the last 20 or 30 years, and it's like a journey. It's so different from the Billy Graham model. You don't invite your friends to a rally where there's a big preach and you respond at the end of it. You invite people to supper. And over the course of 15 weeks, the Christian faith is explored and explained. And people are invited to make a response. So it's still very clearly the same ministry of explaining and commending the Christian faith, but the model for doing it has changed massively. It's much more like the Emmaus road than the Damascus road. But we also see this in the Roman Catholic Church, in the renewal of the catechumenate and the RCIA in the Roman Catholic Church. We see it in South America in base communities. We see it in the Methodist Church, in their rediscovery of the very heart of Methodism, which was those small groups that met together. In all kinds of ways, we see the catechumenate being renewed across the world church, and its purpose is to evangelize, to share, commend and explain the Christian faith to those who are not yet Christians. Not quite onto the Bible yet. So, today's poem. Okay, today's poem. And then we're going to get into the scriptures itself. And today's poem is by the Irish poet Denis O'Driscoll. And Denis O'Driscoll, as if you know his poetry, he died earlier this year. And this poem is called Missing God. Missing God. And it's the most fantastic, some of you may know the poem, it's the most fantastic poem which somehow manages to get inside the longing in the culture for God. I'm sure this is something most of you are aware of, but I think we need to be deeply encouraged by this. The longing in the culture for God. Inchoate and unformed, inarticulate, but very, very real. We don't, certainly in Europe, I guess it's the same in Canada, though I don't know. We don't actually live in a society of atheists. The new atheism is on the rise, but it's still very, very small. The majority of people are kind of, how would we describe it? Interested unbelievers. People who actually are interested in engaging in the things of faith and not at all ready to come to church and really don't want to come to church, don't want to don't want to sing your hymns, don't want to say your creeds. No, that's not where I am at all. But I'm kind of interested. I'm kind of interested in this stuff. And if there was an opportunity to talk about it and find out about it, I would be quite interested in doing that. Because there is this longing. Of course there is. We believe that human beings are made in the image of God. This shouldn't surprise us, and yet we've become so inward looking, we are surprised. Why didn't we run the course on Christian meditation? It never occurred to us. We stopped believing years ago that anyone was interested in our stuff. We've lost confidence in the beauty and power of the gospel. And yet, when we actually do engage with people outside of the church, we find the beauty and the power of the gospel is precisely what they long for. Only they don't call it the gospel. They don't know what the gospel is. So here's a poem which somehow beautifully gets inside that longing in the culture. Dennis O'Driscoll, Missing God. His grace is no longer called for before meals. Farmed fish multiply without his intercession. Bread production rises through disease-resistant grains devised scientifically to mitigate his faults. Yet, though we rebelled against him like adolescents, uplifted to see an oppressive father banished, a bearded hermit to the desert, we confess to missing him at times. Miss him during the civil wedding, when at the blossomy altar of the registrar's desk we wait in vain to be fed a line containing words like everlasting and divine. Miss him when the TV scientist explains the cosmos through equations, leaving our planet to revolve on its axis aimlessly, a wheel skidding in snow. Miss him when the radio catches a snatch of plain chant from some echoey priory, when the gospel choir raises its collective voice to ask, shall we gather at the river? Or the forces of the oratorio converge on, I know that my Redeemer liveth, and our contracted hearts miss a beat. Miss him when a choked voice at the crematorium recites the poem about fearing no more the heat of the sun. Miss him when we stand in judgment on a lank crucifixion in an art museum, its stripe-like ribs testifying to rank. Miss him when the gamma rays recorded on the satellite graph seem arranged into a celestial score, the music of the spheres, the Ave Verum corpus of the observatory lab. Miss him when we stumble on the breast lump for the first time and an involuntary prayer escapes our lips, when a shadow crosses our bodies on an X-ray screen, when we receive a transfusion of foaming blood sacrificed anonymously to save life. Miss him when we call out his name spontaneously in awe or anger, as a woman in the birth ward bawls her long dead mother's name. Miss him when the linen-covered dining table holds warm bread rolls, shiny glasses of red wine. Miss him when a dove swoops from the orange grove in a tourist village just as the monastery bell begins to take its toll. Miss him when our journey leads us under leaves of Gothic tracery, an arch of overlapping branches like hands in Michelangelo's creation. Miss him when, trudging past a church, we catch a residual blast of incense, a perfume on par with fresh-baked loaf, which Milosz compared to happiness. Miss him when our newly decorated kitchen comes in shaker style and we order a matching set of Mother Ann Lee chairs. Miss him when we listen to the prophecy of astronomers that the visible galaxies will recede as the universe expands. Miss him the way an uncoupled glider riding the evening thermals misses its tug. Miss him as the lovers, shrugging shoulders outside the cheap hotel, ponder what their next move should be. Even feel nostalgic odd days for his second coming, like standing in the brick dome of a dovecot after the birds have flown. So, with that poem in our minds, let us turn to the scriptures. And let us turn to the confusion and longing of those two disciples on that first Easter day as they made their way to Emmaus. And to get us into the story, here are some questions. And the questions are carefully designed so that there isn't really, well, maybe with one of them there is, but there isn't really an obvious right answer. There's a few wrong answers, but there's no obvious right answer. And so, you should all have a copy of, if you've got your service sheet, you've got a copy of the story. Could you turn, we can't really get into groups here, but could you turn to your neighbours in twos or threes, in huddles, and just start, doesn't matter if you don't get through all the questions, just for the next 10 or 15 minutes, could you start puzzling your way through those questions? Okay, we're starting again. So welcome back. But before we delve back into the Emmaus Road story, just a kind of little interlude, post-coffee interlude. I do, although God has blessed me with the gift of sleep, I do sometimes find myself lying awake at night, wondering how people can possibly live the Christian life without reading my books. That is something it is something that worries me. But I notice with horror that whatever books there might have been on the table downstairs have already been sold by wise and discerning clergy in the Diocese of Toronto. So whoever you are, congratulations on your good taste. However, there are a few of the pilgrim books still there. And although we're going to say a bit more about this tomorrow, the practical outworking of models of evangelism for the local church, clearly the big implication of what we're doing this morning is simply this, that in most of our churches, well, in all of our churches, we need to have somewhere where people who are not yet Christians can find out and explore the Christian faith. And that place is unlikely to be a Sunday morning, though maybe, if we rethought Sunday morning, we'll come on to that tomorrow, maybe it could be, but it's unlikely to be Sunday morning. It needs to be somewhere else. And these catechetical models of evangelism, which have been developing in the church over the last 20 or 30 years, are all trying to provide that. They're trying to provide, as it were, an Emmaus Road experience. Somewhere where we, the church, can come alongside those who are seeking and searching and begin to explore what this faith is, and to a large extent allow that process to be led by the questions that people have. I've been involved in writing 2 of these resources. I was one of the authors that wrote a resource called Emmaus, which is used by many, many churches in Britain and around the world. And although I swore never to be involved in such a huge writing project ever again, 3 years ago the Archbishop of Canterbury, no less, wrote to me and said, would I, on behalf of the House of Bishops of the Church of England, put together a resource for evangelism and catechesis. And this was Archbishop Rowan, and the words he used were an Anglican catechumenate, something that could be used by the Anglican Church to help people engage with and receive and explore the Christian faith. I mean, I just don't know what happens in your parishes. The scandal in England is this, that there's been a huge body of research. Many people have done doctorates and academic study on catechetical models of evangelism over the last 20 years. And the research evidence is overwhelming. Churches that, I call it a place of nurture, churches that create a place of nurture where people can come and find out about the Christian faith. Those churches find people come to faith and become Christians. Not in large numbers, it's usually significant small numbers over a long period of time. But the research is overwhelming that it's effective and that there are many, many people who want to find out. And yet, the research also tells us that 60% of Anglican churches do not put on courses like this and have never put on courses like this. 60%. I mean, I think it's nothing short of a scandal. Certainly in the diocese where I serve, we have made it our stated aim that every single church should have a place of nurture. Well, I mean, like I say, I've got no idea what happens or doesn't happen in Canada. But put it this way, what is your emphatic yes for the ministry of the church where you serve? What are the few things, more than anything else, that you absolutely should be doing? The way I explain it in Chelmsford is like this. Say you don't call it PCC, do you? Church Council, what do you call it? Your I didn't get that. Advisory board. So that's like our PCC. Okay, your advisory board. Say at your next advisory board meeting, somebody says we're going to cancel all worship at this church from now on. No services on Sunday, no services in the week. It's all going to be cancelled. Say that's put forward by somebody as a proposition and it passes unanimously. With one exception. The one exception is you. You're sitting there and just something's nagging away in your head that you kind of think, this doesn't feel like a good decision. But you don't want to rock the boat, you want to seek consensus, so you abstain on the motion. But you don't feel very comfortable about it. And so the next day, you kind of have a bit of a sleepless night, you wake up, you decide to give the bishop a ring and say, Bishop, our advisory board made this decision last night, we decided to cancel all worship, we're not going to worship ever again in our church. Say that happened, and the bishop then, got on his bike, came down to your parish, called a meeting of the advisory board, and said, what the blazes is going on here? Say that happened. I don't think people in other churches, your neighbours round about, would say of the bishop, well, he's very dictatorial, your bishop. Fancy him coming down and telling you what to do and what not to do. I think people would say, Yeah, of course. Worship is what we do as a Christian community. And if we stop worshipping, well, we've stopped being a Christian community. It's as basic as that. So my point is, it's not difficult to agree on that. We may worship in different ways, but worshipping is who we are. What I'm interested in is, what else is as basic as that about being a Christian community? So basic that if we didn't do it, we would have stopped being a Christian community. And I know it's uncomfortable to have to face this one, but what I am, well, more than suggesting, I'm saying this is how I see it. That if we are not evangelizing, well, we've stopped being a Christian community. I mean, if you want to read about this, the best things to read are the documents from the Roman Catholic Church. And at this point, I wished I brought one of them with me to quote. I'm going to have to quote from memory. But Pope Paul VI's encyclical, Evangelization in the Modern World, and I'm quoting from memory, says something like this: the apostles' teaching, fellowship with one another, the breaking of bread itself, only acquire their full meaning when they become witness. Now that's a really powerful thing for a pope to say. Because the implication of that is, you haven't really ever received the sacrament if it has not so changed you that it has overflowed into witness. It only acquires its full meaning when it becomes witness. I believe to be an evangelizing church is that basic. We are called to be a worshipping and a witnessing community. The two go together. We give from the overflow of what we have received. Therefore, it is just non-negotiable that every church ought to have some kind of strategy for evangelization, and it ought to have as part of that, because that seems to be what the Holy Spirit is doing in the world at the moment, it needs to have some kind of place of nurture where catechesis is happening, not just about discipling the people of God, but the way in which those who are not yet Christians come and engage with the Christian faith, have their Emmaus Road experience, explore and discuss what it means to follow Christ. So I'm not trying to do a big sell on Pilgrim. Pilgrim is just a resource that helps you do that. What's good about it is it's a thoroughly Anglican, though of course health warning, English resource. So I don't know whether it'll travel to a Canada. I've got no idea, but have a look at it and see what you think. But it's an English resource to do that work. But because it's Anglican, because it understands Anglican tradition, Anglican theology, Anglican liturgy, it fits in many parishes in the way that some other resources, which are extremely good, maybe don't fit. In England, we've got thousands of churches use Alpha, but as I said, 60% of churches don't use anything. And so Pilgrim is very, very specifically trying to reach out to those churches which currently don't do anything. To say every church needs to have a place of nurture where people can find out about the faith. Anyway, commercial over, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow. Back to the scriptures. So we got to question number 3, just about, what makes them recognise Jesus, though we skated over "you foolish men so slow to believe" on question 2. Yes, Jesus begins with that incredible openness to their agenda. What are you discussing as you walk along? But it's not, this is a robust conversation on the Emmaus Road. Yes, of course Jesus listens, but he speaks as well. And again, you can't separate out the two. The reason Jesus speaks with such precision is because he listens so well. I love that book by Pete Ward, the Anglican priest who's very involved in emerging church and fresh expressions of church. And in one of his books he writes, and again I'm quoting from memory, what really irritated me about Jesus growing up as a young evangelical was that Jesus never preached the gospel. Which of course is, it's true in the sense that, that kind of 3-point preaching of the gospel, much beloved of certain sorts of evangelicals. Jesus never says that in the Bible. He's got this irritating habit of meeting people where they are, of listening before he speaks. And then, of course, when he does speak, his words have precision. They have clarity, because he speaks directly into the situation. And of course, again, as we know, it's exactly the same, really, throughout the whole New Testament. What Paul says in Corinth is different from what he says in Athens. Why? Same gospel, but why does he speak differently? Because it's a different context. And what Paul does, as Jesus does, is engage very, very clearly and carefully with that context, listens to it carefully, learns it, and is therefore able to speak into it. And that's what's happening on the Emmaus Road, but it is a robust conversation. You foolish men, so slow to believe. Tone of voice is everything here, isn't it? I mean, that could be anger, but it could also just be exasperation. They just haven't got it. Anyway, question 3, what makes them recognise him? This superficially is the easy question in the pack. So what makes them recognise him? The breaking of the bread. It's like too embarrassing to say, isn't it, in case it's wrong. I can feel the tension. You're sitting there saying, I really thought Mary was the first thing that Jesus said on the first Easter day. I was so confident. So is it breaking of the bread? Could it be? Did I miss something? Well, yes, you did. Yes, you did. Because yes, it's the breaking of the bread. But the beauty of this narrative is what you might call layers of recognition running through the story. So as soon as they do recognise him in the breaking of the bread, they then say, didn't our hearts burn within us when he talked to us on the road? And so they start to see, okay, so this is the moment of recognition, but now I look back, and don't we know that in our own lives and in the lives of those to whom we minister, that people come to a living faith in Jesus Christ, and then they look back and see, oh, but actually God was always with me. He was always with me, but I never saw him, never recognised his presence in my life. And then there's also that beautiful moment of tentative invitation at the heart of the story. I love this bit of the story. When they came to the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, stay with us. It is almost evening and the day is nearly over. It's a beautiful little moment in the story that they get to Emmaus, and even then, the gracious, courteous Lord waits to be invited in. He makes as if to go on. And we need to speculate that, of course, they might not have invited him in. And if they had not invited him in, he would have stayed not invited in. That's the way it is. That Jesus is not going to force himself upon you or upon anyone. And therefore, we cannot force him upon anyone. There is no place for coercion, manipulation, inappropriate judgment within the ministry of evangelism. Rather, as Jesus on the Emmaus Road, so in our parishes, we need to use different images to understand the ministry of evangelism. We need to be good companions who meet people where they are, walk with them while they're going in the wrong direction, share our faith with them, listen to them, engage in dialogue, bear witness. We need to be living signposts, witnesses, saying, this is how I see it, this is my experience, this is how I understand it. But we can't make people become Christians, and we shouldn't, in that sense, we shouldn't try, not in the sense of forcing people. But we unashamedly commend the goodness and the beauty of the gospel as we have received it. So Jesus makes as if to go on. They invite him in. Question to ask at this point is, why did they invite him in? Why did they invite him in at this point? And I think the answer's obvious and worth taking hold of. They invite him in because he's good to be with. That's the reason. It's just a very ordinary human reason. He's good to be with. That's what we do, we human beings. When we meet someone who's good to be with, we want to carry on being with them. And we say, come and have a drink, come and have a meal. We invite people in. And why is Jesus good to be with? Well, again, the answer's obvious, but let's get hold of it. The reason he's good to be with is because he listened to them. And we know, don't we, in our own lives, how very powerful it is when someone listens to you. We also know, from bitter experience, how very demeaning it is when someone doesn't listen to you. And I think there's a kind of warning to clergy, because we can sometimes be pretty bad at this. Remember last night, everyone's hunting for you. There's all the people on a Sunday morning clamouring round you. And it's very easy to not listen. It's very easy to be distracted. It's very easy to want to hold on to our agenda and say, well, okay, so I am talking to you, but really I want to talk to that person over there. So we know what it's like to be listened to. We know what it's like to not be listened to. Jesus is a good listener, and he's good to be with. And also, when he speaks, our hearts burn within us. And we need to be great practitioners of wooing people for Christ. We need to be winsome in the way that we speak about the gospel. Again, it comes back to that question of last night: where is my place of receiving? Where is the place where I am being evangelized? Where is the place where I am on fire for the gospel? Because unless I have such a place, when I do have these encounters with people, be it in day-to-day pastoral ministry or in a group that I've set up to help people find out about faith, what am I sharing? Am I sharing some stale old story of what happened 30 years ago when I first became a Christian? Or is Jesus alive for me today? So that I can share with people where God is for me right now. And then he breaks the bread. And as he breaks the bread, he assumes the role of the host. And that in itself is a powerful thing. He's the guest, and now he suddenly assumes the role of the host. He breaks the bread, their eyes are open. I think in the context of today's Bible study, I want to say it happened to be the breaking of the bread. It happened to be the breaking of the bread. And as we know in our lives and in lives of those to whom we minister, it could be all sorts of things where suddenly things click into place and people see. And St. Luke, in constructing the narrative, says their eyes were opened. Because even then, he wants to emphasise the giftedness of faith. That somehow the Spirit is at work in opening eyes, just as the Spirit was at work in closing eyes. It is a profound mystery. Let's also pause for a moment and pat ourselves on the back as Anglicans, because it's impossible to read this story without discerning the pattern of the Eucharist within the story. That's not precisely, that's a whole other Bible study, looking at the story in a whole other way, but let's at least take note of it. The presence of Christ in the breaking open of the Word, the presence of Christ in the breaking open of the bread. The importance and pattern and symmetry of word and sacrament. There it is, laid out for us in this story. But let's race on to question 4. What is their new attitude to him? Did you get on to this question, or had you started talking about hockey or whatever it is that you might talk about when you get bored with the Bible? What is their new attitude to him? Did anybody get on to this one?
Excitement.
Yeah, well, sorry, I can't see where you are. Excitement, yeah, excitement, yeah.
They were re-evangelized.
Yeah, they were re-evangelized, yeah.
I think it's that joy that they want to then go and share. They run to Jerusalem, right? That they can't wait to share with others.
Yeah. There's a real metanoia, isn't there? Let's not separate out Damascus and Emmaus too much. There's a real metanoia here. They are literally turned around, reorientated. and they rush back to Jerusalem. They can't wait to share with others what they've received. You'll remember last night we drew the conclusion that Jesus wasn't an Anglican vicar. And today we can also draw the conclusion that neither were Cleopas and his companion, whoever he or she was. I think if they'd been Anglicans at this point, this would be the point where you'd say, we must, they'd have sat down in their leather armchairs, ordered a brandy and said, perhaps this is the Church of England, maybe not Canadian Anglicans. In the Church of England, they'd have ordered a brandy and said to each other, well, wasn't that interesting? I do believe... I do believe, if I'm not very much mistaken, we have just encountered the risen Christ. We must write a paper for a learned journal on this experience. That's what they would have done. But they weren't Anglicans, they weren't Church of England ministers. So what do? Is they rush back. They are turned around, they rush back. And isn't that, going back to what is essential about being a Christian community, isn't that the true mark of discipleship? Whatever else we say about discipleship, the true mark of the disciple is the one who cannot but help give from the overflow of what they have received. What they have received and experienced is so momentous that they have to share it, that they can't keep it for themselves. They know it's for them. This revelation is for them, but they also instantly and intuitively know it's not just for them. If it's good news for them, it must be good news for everyone. And the thing is, there's been in the past a certain sort of liberal Christianity which has shied away from this, kind of gobsmackingly obvious conclusion that if it's good news for me, it must be good news for everyone. And I know that's deeply uncomfortable for some of us, but you explain to me how it can possibly be different. If it is good news for me, it must be good news for everyone. And therefore, I cannot but help share what I've received. And I believe if we share what we've received in a way that patterns what happens on the Emmaus Road, there is no need for us to be fearful, because we are sharing the good news of what we have experienced as living signposts and as good companions. We're not forcing anybody to respond to this, but we are unashamedly telling it how it is as we have received it. And that's the kind of communities we need to be. There's of course a twist in the tale, as there always is in Scripture, which must have been a kind of like a really big disappointment for Cleopas and his companion, because they rush back. It's late at night. It's pretty dangerous out there in the dark. They rush back to Jerusalem. As soon as they get there, they say the Lord has risen. As soon as they get there, the 11 say to them, the Lord has risen. And oh, blimey, that's what we were coming to tell you. I mean, must have been really, really annoying. And then, to cap it all, who's there amongst them? Well, it's Jesus himself. There he is. And I thought, oh, blimey, oh, well, here we go. So it's an amazing story. It's an amazing story from which we can draw a number of conclusions for our own ministry. First of all, should have said this right at the beginning of the day. Fantastic good news and huge relief. God is the evangelist. All right? I should have said that at the beginning. God is the evangelist. I worked, as you'd heard from my CV last night, I worked as an evangelist in the Church of England, part of the Archbishop of Canterbury's mission team, on and off for nearly 9 years. I worked as an evangelist for nearly 9 years, and I have to tell you, I was a total flop. In 9 years of working as an evangelist, 4 of those years full-time, I never converted anybody, not a single person. But, if you get my meaning, I did have the privilege of being the midwife at quite a number of safe deliveries. And it's really, really important to get it that way round. I can't convert anybody to the Christian faith, and I shouldn't try. But that image of the midwife, let's put that on top of the good companion, the living signpost. These are things I can do in God's ministry of evangelism. Do you see, it's God's ministry in which we participate. And God is the evangelizer. God is the one who longs to be known. God is the one who shows himself in Christ as the great lover and longs for the free response of our love to his love. Therefore, as we've laboured through the morning, we need to meet and serve people where they are. This is a pastoral Anglican model of evangelism which begins with our service in the local communities. That we need to listen before we speak and enter into conversation and dialogue and build a place of nurture. We'll talk a bit more about that tomorrow, but it's pretty fundamental for effective evangelism in the local church today. That, just to put it really kind of as bluntly as I can, if you this evening or tomorrow when you get back home bump into somebody in the street, maybe you took their parents' funeral 6 months ago, they bump into you and they say, I feel really stupid saying this to you, but you remember my mum died 6 months ago, remember you took the funeral. I don't know, there was something you said in the sermon that I just can't let go of. And the thing is, I feel stupid saying this to you because I don't really believe in God. But I can't let go of this kind of something inside me which thinks maybe there is a God. Maybe it's true. I've just got so many questions. I just want to find out a bit more about this Christian faith. If you had such an encounter tomorrow evening, how is your church geared up for helping and receiving such a person on their journey of faith? Remember, for most people becoming a Christian is like a journey. Therefore, the work of evangelism is best understood as helping people make the journey. Now, of course, actually the best response is for you to say, look, let's go and have a drink, or let's, I'll come around for a cup of tea tomorrow. Well, coffee probably in your case, but you can't do that with everybody. Your time is limited. You need to be unavailable some of the time in order to be available at other times. So the best way of doing it is to establish some place of nurture in the local church where these conversations can happen. And, perhaps I haven't said enough about this, within the context of that, we need to be prepared to challenge. Yes, of course, Jesus listened on the Emmaus Road, but he also said some very, very challenging things. He said to them how stupid they were. He gave them a completely new interpretation of their own tradition. It was deeply challenging, but it was also deeply engaging because it started with their questions. So we do need to be prepared to challenge. Obviously, I've never been a midwife, but I think the image of midwife is a really, really rich image for evangelism. And of course, the Bible does have something to say about being born again, you may remember. But there's a point, isn't there? I was present at the birth of my 3 sons. What amazing days they were. And I noticed in each time, there's a time where the midwife says, right, now, push. And it can be a long, long process, the labour, and then there comes a time, right, and up until a certain point, you mustn't push. You've got to hold back from pushing. Now's the time to push. And so even if we think of evangelism as helping people make the journey, there will be points along the road where we have to really challenge hard. And I find myself in my own, living out of this ministry, often saying to people, you could spend the rest of your life, as it were, walking around the swimming pool of the Christian faith, wondering what it's like. There comes a point where you've just got to get in and find out whether this is true. And the only way you're going to find out now is by becoming part of this. I remember one man, this is a true story, one man in the parish where I served many years ago, who who said, I want to believe, but I don't believe. I want to believe, but I don't believe. And he came along to lots of groups and lots of stuff. And in the end, I said to him, I think the best thing is if you start coming to church. I said, just start. If you really do want to believe, start acting as if you do. And I said, because you've been on all the courses, you've done everything, and you've still got all these questions, and they're probably never going to go away. Now, it was a bit of a risk to tell him, start coming to church, but I think, in the context of his journey, that was the right thing to do. But at the same time, there needs to be that waiting to be invited in, and that living and sharing what we have received. So, in preparation for tomorrow, as we look at some of the practicalities of this, can I ask you, just for a few minutes before we finish this morning, to get back into your little huddles of 2s and 3s, and just try to draw some of this together. In other words, could you please write my session for me tomorrow? That's, I suppose, the question is, from all that we've explored this morning, what's this actually telling you? Where are you feeling a bit uncomfortable at the moment, okay? Where are you feeling a bit uncomfortable that actually, maybe in our church we haven't really paid proper attention to this ministry. We've not really thought it through. We're still operating a come to us policy. Where are you feeling a bit uncomfortable? What could and should you be doing about this? I'll give you one practical answer. Next advisory board meeting that you have at your church, put a nice big thick red pen through the whole agenda, get out your Bibles and spend the meeting studying the Emmaus Road story together. I promise you it'll be the best meeting you'll have for years. Just spend the whole meeting looking at the scriptures together. You'll come up with some far more interesting conclusions than all the other stuff on your agenda. Anyway, so just a few minutes now, just beginning to draw some conclusions for your parish from this. Then there might be a little bit of time for questions. We'll see how we go. So 5 minutes with each other. You'll be heartily relieved to hear that I don't think I've got anything else to say on this story for the time being. That there's lots of other stories and pictures I'd love to share with you, but they'll have to wait. But does anybody want to, anybody feel moved to say something which perhaps impacted them about this story which hasn't been said? Because we've by no means exhausted the beauty and possibilities of this story, or a question that's burning away inside you. Yes, shout it out.
The insight is that I need to get out of the physical structure of the building and go to the skateboard park and go to the, food bank dropping and just be present.
Yeah.
So people are not feeling Jesus in their life.
Yeah.
Right? But they don't see him in
Yeah.
their reality.
And also, yes, you do, but also not just you. That's the other thing is Jesus sent them out in pairs. Ministry belongs to the whole people of God. This is never going to happen if we think it's just our ministry. As I say at virtually every licensing of a new priest I ever take, the job of the vicar is not to do the ministry. The job of the vicar is to ensure the ministry is done. It's an episcopal ministry. It's an episcopal ministry of oversight, releasing, energizing, animating the ministry of the whole people of God. And so it's actually being about an evangelizing church, not just an evangelizing minister, though goodness knows, an evangelizing minister would at least be a good start. And one of the best ways, Jesus' model for training was, come with me, you'll learn on the job. So go to the food banks, go to those places, but take someone with you. Train and encourage and animate others in this ministry. Thank you very much. Yes?
I think one of the things that for me is that it sort of reminds that I think we need to re-evangelize. We need to be re-evangelized, but our churches need to be re-evangelized. Thinking about the context, we haven't been there that long. But a lot of people don't have that exuding joy that from the gospel. And I don't think they've heard it in some cases for a long time. And there's that sense, in some ways, our parishes need to be re-evangelized in doing, but also in just hearing it again and hearing it from from people that are exuding that joy and that sort of overflow.
Yes, absolutely. The one kind of little warning I'd give from my own experience on that is, yes, as long as you don't fall into the trap of thinking, we will do mission, we will do evangelism when we are ready. And the point is, you're never going to be ready. And the biblical truth is that we give from the overflow of what we have received, but the paradox is, it is in giving that we receive. So there's this kind of interplay between the giving and the receiving and the giving. So when somebody says to me that they want to learn more about their faith, I usually say to them, give it away. Give it away to someone, and in the refining fire of other people's questions to your sharing of the gospel, you will find out a lot about your faith, much more than you'll ever find it with your head buried in a book or on a course. Nothing wrong with books and courses. I write a lot of them. But actually, the way to renew the faith of your congregation is to enable them to share it. But yes, you're right. I think we've got time for one last question or comment. Yes?
Well, I was thinking when I just Christians in school, but I never thought like different. I just started reading the Bible every other Friday morning for Christian, and for now, I was about to go there every day. And both drink our coffee. He goes to Tim Hortons, and I go to my office and read the Bible. Why are we doing that? Why don't we just leave it in the Bible?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
But then you have to pick one.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've been given a prophetic word of knowledge. Don't go to Starbucks. The coffee is lousy and they don't pay their taxes. And I'm glad you finished that sentence. I thought you said, I've had an insight, I'm going to read the Bible. I thought, but I'm glad you finished. Yeah. But yes, as we may come on to talk about tomorrow, I hope we will, one of the big challenges of this way of thinking about evangelism is that we build a place of nurture where people can begin to explore and experience the Christian faith. And probably in our minds, we've got a picture that that's a stepping stone towards real church, which is what happens on Sunday morning. Well, no, please get rid of that idea out of your head as well. It might be, or it might, of course, be that when you create that place of nurture, you are planting a church. And that little community of would-be disciples is going to become a church. And the other interesting thing the Holy Spirit is doing in the church, there seems to be the two things. I've mentioned the renewal of the catechumenate. The other is what goes under the banner of fresh expressions of church. And so it might not be that this is the stepping stone into church. It might be this way of doing evangelism is also at the same time church planting. And just two of you meeting in an independent coffee house selling fair traded coffee who pay their taxes might become a church. There's an interesting biblical precedent for a couple of people. Let me finish by saying this. I've spoken a lot over the years. I mean, as I hope you've realised, this is deep in my heart. About becoming a Christian is like a journey. Therefore, evangelism is best understood as helping people make the journey. Therefore, we need to get to work on that in our parishes. I gave a talk similar to this, years ago, and afterwards, we weren't doing the Bible study of the Emmaus Road. I was just giving a talk about catechetical models of evangelism. After the talk, some very sceptical person came up to me and said, "Oh, Bishop, all this newfangled stuff about becoming a Christian is like a journey. When did that all come in?" And of course, I was able to give them a precise answer. I said, tea time on the first Easter day. So here's a way of thinking about evangelism which is rooted in our scriptures and our tradition, resonates with our Anglican way of being Christian, and really should be alive and kicking in every single parish. Thank you for listening this morning. Do we go straight into the song, or is somebody going to say something else?
Read it to the song.
Today's picture, that's the Emmaus Road. That really is the Emmaus Road. And it's, as you can see, it's not an easy path, but it's worth treading.